So I don't think I've got any timings on the slides, but you never know. So the title of the presentation is Colonisation, Co-Production and Decolonisation through the lenses of people, power and process in survivor research. Which is a bit of a mouthful really, isn't it? So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to introduce the SRN manifesto to show where we are coming from as an organisation. I'm going to talk a little bit about that us and them thing and the false dichotomy of the us and them. I'm going to look at definitions of co-production and talk a little bit about people, power and process in research, and give an example of Eurocentricity in mental well-being and mental health research. And health is in inverted commas, because we know it goes way beyond that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the researchers. What we look for is often what we find. And then talk about Eurocentricity in mental well-being and epistemic justice and two types of co-production. And then I'm going to end with a potential third way. So I'm going to talk about decolonialism, feminism, and revolutionary Ubuntu. So we shall see. It's really interesting because you get all these pop-up things in the middle of all of this. And you have to sort of close them and move them around to see what you've written. So in our manifesto, we say that SRN, Survivor Researcher Network, wants to provide survivor researchers with a forum for networking, sharing information and supporting each other by 1, challenging the hierarchy of evidence and promoting the validity of experiential and survivor knowledges, as well as qualitative, participatory and emancipatory research methods. I'll be bearing that in mind throughout the actual presentation. Want to promote and support authentic and influential service user and survivor involvement and leadership in research, which is often missed within the research process. And we want to continue to seek new partnerships with other organisations and institutions to increase opportunities for SRN members and to ensure that genuine, meaningful co-production and involvement in research actually takes place. So a little bit, first of all, to begin with, about the us and them dichotomy in relation to research. So I'm going to play a little piece of music by Sinead O'Connor called The Queen of Denmark. If you haven't heard it, it's the first, it's called a stanza in music. I think it is, isn't it? First stanza that this relates to. And I listened to it the other day and it really reminded me of why I don't like the us and them thing. So I'll put that on now. Can everybody hear that? Good. It's just loading. Ooh.
I can't hear it, Jackie. It's not clear. You might have to just read it.
Okay.
There is just slight noise coming out, really.
Yeah, but it doesn't sound
I beg your pardon. Okay. So I wanted to change the world, but I could not even change my underwear. And when the shit got really, really out of hand, I had it all the way up to my hairline, which keeps receding like my self-confidence, as if I really had any of that stuff anyway. I hope I didn't destroy your celebration or your bar mitzvah birthday party or your Christmas. You put me in this cage and threw away the key. Was this us and them shit did me in? So basically what she's talking about is her own mental distress and her own experience of mental distress. And that false dichotomy, the idea that actually there is an us and them, actually in reality, it's only us. We are sort of all we've got, really. and we're as good as it gets, because every one of us is open to experiencing mental distress at any point in our existence. So it was from that place that I wanted to share what Sinead O'Connor was saying. Oh, wrong current slide. Sorry, I'll whiz through to get back to where I was. You don't know the Queen of Denmark. It's a wonderful, wonderful song. My kids and I often sing it out loud in the car because it's got a fabulously loud chorus. So to get back to co-production, the definition of co-production has been defined by the New Economics Foundation, Slane Stevens in 2013, said, it's a relationship where professionals and citizens share power to plan and deliver support together, recognizing that both partners have vital contributions to make in order to improve quality of life for people and communities. And I think it's really interesting that that is the most used definition that I've found in all of the literature that I've looked within. And it still talks about doing things for people, not with people. And further, they stated that it is the most effective method of achieving outcomes with people. They don't actually, there's any evidence in order to support that assertion. And they excluded peer support from the review that they did of co-production. And basically they said there was so much information on peer support that they couldn't possibly include it all in. So they decided not to include it at all, which to me makes no sense. Needham and Carr in 2009 said the ritual of co-production may very well perpetuate regimes of control and containment of mental health patients that have little efficacy. So although co-production seems to be like the flavour of the month at the moment and is very much being used and spoken about within researcher and within services, so within those circles, I would say that we need to be wary of, there seem to be a lot of different types of co-production. So I'm going to argue for a survivor-led type of co-production. So thinking about people and power and co-production in itself in terms of the process, we know that the National Health Service in the UK is an inherently racist organisation. And that's Kapadia and Zhang et al. In 2022. And I wonder about other institutions in other countries, if there is information that you have in relation to institutional racism within other countries, I'd be delighted to hear about that and to receive those papers or links to papers. British Psychological Society is campaigning for class to be added to the list of protected characteristics in relation to disabled people. I think is a really good initiative. And I was thinking about the intersections of class, racism, and also of sexuality, and also of gender and no gender at all. World Health Organization recognized that power differentials in mental health services are evidenced by the excessive use of force in detention, restraint, and coercion around the globe. So I was wondering, how do we share power in co-production with professionals when we can't find common ground in relation to our own common humanity, the organisations that the professionals are working within? And I think that itself does not bode well for co-production practice. So in terms of the process, know that a lot of research is Eurocentric. It's heteronormative and white is in capital letters because it is white. And it is to a large extent conducted and published by white, middle-class, cisgendered, heterosexual Europeans who exclude research conducted in mental health in middle and low-income countries in the global south. For example, which is, I think, a really good example of exclusion, Price et al. Have recently published their volume looking at the volume, diversity and nature of recent robust evidence for the use of peer support in health and social care. And they did what's called an evidence and gap map. And there's a link to that there, and I can put it in the chat if people are interested. So their reasoning behind why they only included people in high-income research in high-income countries was, as defined by the World Bank, was that because the funders of the map that they were working with, but within a healthcare system in a high-income country, and this restriction ensured the map contained the most relevant information for them. I would argue with their logic there. So it seems like what they've done is prioritised the funders and let them guide the parameters of the research that they conduct, more than they've actually prioritised the people that might benefit from the knowing about this map. And that means they've left out things like there was a randomised controlled trial of the friendship benches in Zimbabwe. People sit down and have peer-to-peer supported conversations with each other on an actual park bench. And they've also excluded the Tree of Life work that Mazelo Nube does, her organisation FOLA in South Africa, and also the work that she does around courage and the Life in a Suitcase project that have all been evaluated. So it seems to me that there's an arrogance that goes with high-income countries deciding that they're just going to exclude all of the other low to middle income countries because they couldn't possibly have anything to teach us in Europe, when actually I would strongly disagree with that. So my argument is what you look for is what you find. So when they did this systematic review, what they found was that a lot of the economic evaluations and the systematic reviews tended to be of low or medium quality. They keep randomized controlled trials as their sort of gold star. So they were generally of higher quality because that's the way that they look at quality. And I would argue that that's not necessarily the way we would look at quality. They had few studies, particularly systematic reviews, looking at, quote, case management peers. So there were peers that were actually managing people's cases, which is a really, again, a dehumanizing, medicalized language. Studies look mostly at the effectiveness of peer support in improving health, both physical and mental, as well as well-being and social connection. But I wonder what the outcomes would have been in those studies if survivor researchers and people using services had been involved in actually deciding what the outcomes what they were looking for. There were very few studies that examined the cost effectiveness of peer support, and I think we would have got more of that if they'd have cast their net a bit wider. The majority of studies that they looked at took place in America, and there was a gap regarding the integration of peers and professionals in delivering support. So there was no co-production in those reports. The evidence on long-term peer support was limited, with studies generally focusing on short-term interventions of up to 3 months or 6 months. So there weren't any long-term interventions in the actual study, which I think, again, shows the economic priorities that exist within European social mental health services. And there was no mention of minoritized communities or diversity or anything to do with discrimination, with equity, with equality. I think for somebody for a research that's looking at systematic reviews, I think, I think it just speaks volumes.
Well, there's no sound, Jackie. Is there
no sound at all?
No.
Okay. So basically, what she was saying was that the way that we look at services and mental health services is extremely Eurocentric, and what it doesn't do is take account of the needs of women, Black women and people from different ethnic backgrounds. And she said she doesn't want to be told by a white woman she needs to practice mindfulness. What she actually wants to do is to celebrate the diversity that she experiences and the joy that she feels when she's actually with people Black women from within her own community, celebrating dance and exercising dance with the women themselves. So she's arguing that as a social worker and a therapist and a person with lived experience, that what we need actually is less Eurocentricity, more diversity in terms of the way that we approach mental health services, peer support in itself. So Femi Aromaseli, who's a researcher who published in the Routledge International Handbook on mad studies, said, unwittingly or otherwise, researchers who work with madness reproduce the power differential and epistemic injustice they seek to shed light on. So whether we do it, whether we know it or we don't know it, actually, without having the awareness of epistemic injustice and how people are excluded because of inequality and inequity, we can actually reproduce a situation that we want to actually shed some light onto. Sarah Carr also said, mental health has been the most challenging field for co-production to gain traction and have an impact on the ability of politically positioned service users and survivors to determine and lead on system transformation, because that's basically what co-production is about actually transforming the systems so that they better meet the needs of the people that are actually going to use them. The co-production project is not just to improve mental health service provision and research, but to fundamentally transform systemic power relationships. So there are two distinct types of co-production that have been raised by Sarah Carr and others. So one is concerned with citizens engaging with public services to improve delivery and outcomes. The other is more radical and broader and focuses on social justice and achieving, quote, a core economy where social and emotional contributions are valued as much as financial ones. So the two people that are credited with having developed those two styles of co-production are Eleanor Ostrom and Edgar Kahn, respectively. So I would like to propose a third way I think we could begin to think about co-production, and that is using Ubuntu as a philosophy and how human beings that brings into our awareness the way in which we as human beings are interdependent, and to get away from that European individualizing framework. So Ubuntu is a philosophy on how human beings are intertwined in a world of ethical relations from the moment they are born. So it basically says, I am me because you are you, and I cannot be me unless you are you. So what it brings with it is a mutual obligation to others. The others are, again, obligated to us. So Rancière talked about Ubuntu as staging dissensus, as allowing us to have a space in which we can disagree with each other, actually not agree with what the general consensus of opinion is in relation to how we are as human beings. So the general consensus being that we're all individuals, whereas with Ubuntu, you would think of yourself as more of an individual as part of a larger group, and that you would be interdependent on the people within your group. So actually what you're arguing for is for everybody to get their needs met. So we are mutually obligated to support each other on our respective paths to becoming unique and singular persons. Ubuntu always engages a social bond, and it implies the moralization of social relations. And this is one aspect of Ubuntu Cornell talks about as being unchanging. So revolutionary Ubuntu, which is what I'm arguing for, is a concept that was put forward by the shack dwellers movement in South Africa. They argue that Ubuntu is an anti-capitalist ideal and that neoliberal capitalism is not consistent with it. So it's not about the money that you have or the economics that you're living within. It's actually about making the world a better place for us all. And economic issues are just one of the issues that we need to consider. By no means are they the primary issue. So revolutionary Ubuntu demands free individuals living and shaping their future as one that is always open transformation, but it's open to transformation in relationship with others. So that is the end of my presentation. And it's not a very long presentation, but there's so much information. It's like hard to sort of pick out all the bits that we could have. And just to add to that, there is a book that I've recently purchased that has just been brought out on co-production. It's called Co-Production Towards Equality in Mental Health Care. It's got a number of editors: Julian Raffay, Don Bryant, Pamela Fisher, Mick McKeown, Catherine Mills, and Tim Thornton, who are all white people, sadly. And when I've been reading the book itself, there are very, very, very few people from different ethnic backgrounds within the book itself. So I've been talking to PCCS and basically saying to them, I think there's a gap in the market here. So we, as an organisation that wants to take account of people from different ethnicities, and that Survivor Researcher Network could potentially fill, so that we could potentially have some people from different cultures and different countries and different backgrounds and different sexualities, and actually talking about co-production from their perspective, rather than it just being the white middle class people who are in positions of power that get to do that.